This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is Planet of the Apes, the original 1968 sci-fi classic with Charlton Heston and company. I'll be talking with two film critics, and we'll be continuing the conversation in a moment. 1968 was a pivotal year in American film, especially so in science fiction, and one of the great classics of that year was the original Planet of the Apes, starring Charlton Heston as the lead character. On the left of the screen is Gordon Briggs. He's appeared a few other times for other films. And on the right side of the screen is Ryan Britt. I like to give my guests a chance to introduce themselves. So Ryan, since you're the newbie, let me ask you if you could give a little background about yourself, film in general, your opinions, and specifically your take on, a broad take on the 1968 film, why it intrigues you still.
Well, thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me on. And I'm just glad that both Gordon and I have last names that are B-R-I. So I feel already I feel like I'm feeling welcome.
And a double consonant.
A double consonant too, yeah. Yeah, I'm a writer and critic. I write about science fiction and fantasy. I wrote the 2015 essay collection Luke Skywalker Can't Read, which you can get from Penguin Random House, where most books are sold. Contrary to popular belief, it's not just about Star Wars, and contrary to popular belief, I do like Star Wars. I'm currently working on a book for Penguin about Star Trek, which comes out next year, called Phasers on Stun, How the Making and Remaking of Star Trek Changed the World. And I talk a little bit about Planet of the Apes in that book, because 68 is a really interesting year for science fiction in general. And I guess I love all the Planet of the Apes movies. With the exception of the Burton film, which I don't love. I like the new films. I like the original series. I love the first film. And I think that my brief take on it, Dan and Gordon, maybe this is a take that someone has had before, but I feel like it's just the best feature-length Twilight Zone episode of all time. Partially because, of course, Rod Serling wrote the screenplay for the film. So that's kind of and I think that's a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
To write a feature-length movie that relies on such a famous twist. So yeah, that's my brief take, Dan, I guess.
And actually, I interviewed Rod Serling's daughter a few years ago, and she insists that her father had much more to do with that original film than is given credit for. But anyway, Gordon.
Cool.
Yeah, Gordon teaches at the University of Rio Grande now in that river-filled state called Ohio. So welcome back, Gordon. If you could give a little précis of who you are and what you do and what you think about Planet of the Apes.
What's up, guys? I'm Gordon Briggs. I'm an English and art instructor at University of Rio Grande Community College. My first introduction to Planet of the Apes was in college. It was a series that had the entire series on DVD. And I want to say I was 21, 22 when I first watched it and really liked it. I was aware of the twist when I went in going in. It's just one of those famous twists that you're aware of. So I was aware of it going in, but it did not impair in any way my enjoyment of the movie, because I think Planet of the Apes has something, going off what Ryan said about the Twilight Zone aspect. I think what Planet of the Apes has a terrific sci-fi premise, which is, I think, at its heart, a role reversal, turning of man into what we would do with a creature in the zoo, and the creature in the zoo is now in control of the society. So I think there's that fundamental role reversal that kind of elevates the movie and allows it to touch on many different issues I'm sure we'll get into, like religion and like race and like technology. So what I really liked about it was that it takes that ordinary thing, apes, animals, and just completely flips it and reverses it. I can go on and give you examples if you want, but
we'll get to that in a moment. Before we just hit the film and even start with the book that Ryan said he wanted to speak of first, I just wanted to compare it with the other great sci-fi film of that year, 2001, because they're sort of the perfect difference between what is now called hard science fiction, a la 2001, and a more soft allegorical science fiction of Planet of the Apes. Do either of you want to start and just talk about those two sort of counterweight great sci-fi films? Maybe Gordon, if you want to start first.
What occurred to me watching Planet of the Apes was not to compare it to 2001, but to really compare it to movies that came out in the 1950s. Because I think what's interesting here is the most popular films that came out in the 1950s, as far as science fiction were, all have this Cold War allegory going on, where it was an alien force attacking Earth or invading Earth. Yeah, there are exceptions like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where it's, it's paranoia and stuff, but it's all about these outsiders coming in. And I think what 2001 and what Planet of the Apes did is like, no. The threat is not from the outside. The threat is inside. As we say, the calls are coming from inside the house. It's not some outside alien threat. It's you. It's you humans that are the problem. And I think what 2001, I think, is more optimistic in its view of technology. It's much more in line with Star Trek in the respect that it tries to be aspirational in its view of the future and aspirational in its view of mankind, where Planet of the Apes, at its heart, I think, is a pessimistic story.
Yeah.
Planet of the Apes stories don't have happy endings. Planet of the Apes stories, the good guy doesn't win. So there's a pessimism to Planet of the Apes I always enjoy.
The one thing, Gordon, though, about the one exception in the 1950s, Forbidden Planet, the monster of the id, that's the one difference.
Yeah. There are exceptions, and there are some stuff like in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, there are aliens, but they look like your neighbors. So,
But Gordon, you're right, though. That's the perception of science. Even if there's like examples, like Dan points out, like of science fiction cinema, and obviously Forbidden Planet's a big exception. But even if there's examples in 50s and 40s sci-fi SF cinema of not being of that ilk, the perception was there because you've got the Susan Sontag essay, The Imagination of Disaster, I think. It's in Against Interpretation. It's in that book. And she writes about science fiction movies. And if you were to read it now, you'd just be like confused because it would not be a reading of science fiction films. So I think that Planet of the Apes definitely broke the mold. I also think that comparing it to 2001 is really interesting because of the two, I actually feel like this is going to be blasphemous to a lot of people, but I think that it holds up better. I think Planet of the Apes holds up a little better than 2001. Something that I've been writing about a lot with 60s science fiction and Star Trek and the Twilight Zone, and I think Planet of the Apes falls into this, is that the kind of kitschy, kooky, corny elements of Planet of the Apes at this point are part of the enjoyment.
Yeah.
To me, like that kitschy thing about it is like, it's not like I like Planet of the Apes in spite of that. I kind of like it because of that as well. Because I grew up in a generation where Planet of the Apes was a classic, right? Like I'm 40. So at the time, that Planet of the Apes is received to me, it's a VHS or it's a movie of the week or something like that. Like it wasn't. So I think that in the context of the 60s, it was very cutting edge. But I think what's more interesting is the staying power that it has outside of its. I mean, it has to have been made in its historical context, right? But the staying power it has outside of that is just way more interesting to me. I guess that's my take on it relative to 2001, which is 2001 is great, but it is kind of you're right, it's aspirational, but it's also like the computer's also trying to murder us. So it has these competing sci-fi tropes, right? Whereas the tropes in Planet of the Apes are kind of like less, you don't see as many movies that are trying to be like Planet of the Apes, I guess. Yeah. And I do think that science fiction cinema was considerably darker for a while. In a good way, in kind of like obviously everything post 77 with Star Wars is kind of like all bets are off in terms of the influences. But I don't know. I found other than the Twilight Zone, Planet of the Apes is unique to me because it doesn't. And you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't seem to have a lot of immediate influences, right? Like it doesn't seem like another movie is like directly influencing it, which is a lot of science fiction movies. You can't say that, even Forbidden Planet's like loosely based on The Tempest or whatever.
Well, let's talk about the author of the book. And he more famously was known for The Bridge on the River Kwai, I believe. Pierre Boulle, Le Planète de Singe, I believe is how it's. French people forgive me, but that's Ryan, you said you wanted to dig into that.
It's sometimes called Monkey Planet in some translations. I mean, that guy wrote the screenplay for Bridge at the River Kwai, like right before Planet of the Apes came out, and it won an Oscar. You know what I mean? So, like, I think that's the other thing in the pantheon of film that people kind of forget a little bit is that, like, that's pretty prestigious. You know what I mean? Like, the guy who wrote the novel that this book was based on just won an Oscar for Best Original Screenplay for, like, what many people consider to be, David Lean?
Yeah.
David Lean's best film and Alec Guinness's most iconic performance, again, before Star Wars. So I think that what I like about the novel, if you've never read it, I guess my one sentence synopsis is that it doesn't take place on Earth. Yeah. The planet of the apes is indeed, in fact, another planet, which they tried to do in the Mark Wahlberg film. That's probably the only thing that they kept the same. And the twists are similar. The end of the book, spoiler alert, is that there's Ulysses, the main character, returns to Earth. And there is a gorilla getting out of a helicopter, I think. And then the book is bookended by narrators who have found a message in a bottle.
Yeah.
That is the whole account of what has occurred. And then the final passage reveals that they are chimpanzees flying a spaceship, and they're intelligent, and they're speaking to each other. So it has this like nested narrative. But I think that what's interesting about the Heston film, the famous '68 film that we're talking about, is that philosophically it's pretty close to the novel. Like, it's not that different. Like what you said, Gordon, that you said it perfectly, that it's just like a role reversal. Like, that's what the book is about. And so it's like about, like where even people that are part of his crew in the book start to revert and become unable to speak. Right, they lose the ability to have language because they're surrounded by the culture. So it's kind of like this anthropological statement where it's like saying, hey, look, like if you were in the Planet of the Apes, you might actually become like one of these other people. You wouldn't necessarily retain what we would consider humanity. And that's the same struggle of the film. And so it's not a faithful adaptation, but philosophically, I think that it is. And the book is a really interesting read. It's really just a fun. I actually can't say a negative thing about the book other than it's not as famous as the film, right?
Yeah. Gordon, have you read the book?
I have not. Okay. What's this reading you guys keep talking about? I never heard this reading.
I used to work for a science fiction publisher called Tor Books, and I worked for their blog called Tor.com for years. And we did a week on Planet of the Apes that was just called Tor.com Goes Ape. This was back in 2011, I think, when the first Franco film was coming out. And so I read the book then. This would have been about 12 years ago, 10 years ago or so. And I hadn't read it then either. So I read it because I had to write about it. And I was really glad that I did.
So let's talk. So let's talk about the setup for the film. We first see Heston alone. He's the captain of his starship or spaceship, whatever you want to call it. He's ready to give himself an injection, put himself into deep sleep. They're supposedly on their way to a nearby star system to be the first or whatnot. And he starts off with this really misanthropic kind of rant about, and by the end of the film, he seems to have changed. But so how about that opening, Gordon? What do you think about the opening? It's a pretty good setup, I think.
Here's what I want to point out. Watching the film again, I realized just how precisely the movie is structured. It's divided into little half-hour acts. If you look at the movie, it's divided into little half-hour bits. This might be Rod Serling's influence here, because the first act, the first half hour, there are no apes.
Yeah.
The first half hour, it's just them arriving. The second half hour is him, a prisoner, having no voice. Third half hour is a trial he's on. The fourth half hour is the escape. So it's very much organized, almost like a TV show, if it were a long-form TV series. One of the things I like about the opening is Charlton Heston's cynicism.
Yeah.
He's cynical towards humanity. and he is going into outer space saying, is there anything better out there?
Yeah.
Earth is going to be a long ways away. I'm not going to go back to Earth. And is Earth still going to declare war? Is Earth still going to rob their neighbor of their bread? And here's the kicker. Here's why Sterling and his collaborators were so good. Sterling's collaborators were so good was because the exact same thing that Charlton Heston says at the start of the film is exactly what the ape says to him at the end on the beach.
Yeah.
So I think whatever you think about Charlton Heston, and we take it as an actor, and they are there, it's actually a very kind of complex and precisely written character of Taylor, who was someone who goes from feeling negative feelings about humanity to kind of clinging to his humanity out of survival, and then with the plot twist ending, losing it again, going, you bastards, you bastards, you blew it up. Because it's never clear who he's actually talking to, the apes or people, about this ending. So I think one of the things that the opening half hour does is establish that Taylor character. Mm-hmm. A different movie would have shown you the apes right away. In fact, Ryan, I think beneath the Planet of the Apes, you see the apes in the first 5 minutes of the thing. Yeah. You see the ape, which is fine for a sequel. But for the first half hour, there is no apes, and it's all establishing Taylor's character. And there are so go on.
But it also has that effect of the third man when Harry Lime first comes up. Where he, we know it's the Planet of the Apes, and it's that first, and then the ape turns around on the horse. Ryan, comment?
Yeah.
No, I think that Gordon's right. Like the pacing of the movie is actually really great, and it makes me miss those kinds of movies. Not that there's a lot. I mean, to your point, the sequel, Taylor refers right back to his cynicism because he destroys the entire Earth. I always joke. I think I joked in my first book about this. Though, like
the white man fucks up again.
It's the only series of science fiction films that has the guts to blow up Earth in the second film, and then have 2-3 sequels that do not actually contradict that continuity. Yeah. Like they actually don't contradict that continuity. In fact, they use it in Escape and Battle Conquest. There's a little bit of weird timeline stuff there, but I think that the word that comes to mind is there's restraint in the pacing for me. So I would agree with Gordon that I feel like that it believes in its premise enough to not sort of jump in with the gimmick right away, and it knows that the movie's not going to work without the character. Yeah. And I mean, we can say a lot about Charlton Heston as a person, but that speech that he gives that you talked about, Dan, it is great because when I rewatched it, in my 20s, there was a new DVD release or something, and I watched it, and I was like, this is an anti-Nam, this is a Vietnam protest guy. But he's got a slick, he looks like one of the guys from The Right Stuff, though, yeah. Right? He looks like a Mercury astronaut. So he has that kind of white bread, all-American, 60s thing going on. But he is a hippie, right? And I think that is sort of it's definitely indicative of its time. But I don't know, that's kind of radical.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? To have somebody that looks like him. And the fact that in real life, his politics probably didn't align with that, or at least they didn't labor. Yeah. Is I think also just I don't know. I kind of love that myself because it just sort of proves that he's a good actor. But yeah, I think that I don't know the interpretation. I've never thought of it, Gordon, that way. That perhaps who is he yelling at the end? I kind of assumed he's yelling at his contemporaries from the time in which he came.
I took it that way.
Yeah. I was looking at it that way. One of the things watching it again that I noticed is how I think it's Jerry Goldsmith who did the score to this.
Great score.
And there's I don't know about the history of musical scores, but I remember a lot of science fiction films have this kind of majestic soundtrack where Jerry Goldsmith comes in and gives little percussion sounds and things like that.
It's disorienting. It's feral. It's feral.
It just makes it more earthy, more down to, I don't know. It makes it more accessible, I think is the word I'm looking
for. Animalistic.
But you're totally right. And Jerry Goldsmith, of course, would be guilty of some of those big orchestral sweeping scores you're talking about. But his one score that's really good that I think is close to the Planet of the Apes score is his score for Total Recall.
Boom.
Yeah. I love that score. Yeah. But that's like one of the few that I'm like, oh, that's the. I mean, I guess Alien is a little bit.
Recall score is very similar to Conan's score.
That's true. I thought of that. Anyway, I do love the music of Planet of the Apes, and it doesn't feel like another movie. When I heard it on at a bookstore once in Brooklyn, like a guy was just playing the score, and I was like, Planet of the Apes, and he was like, yeah. Like you could pick it out anywhere.
Dan, it's interesting because I was doing the background of this movie, and apparently the budget was supposed to be much, much bigger.
Yeah.
And I think even in Rod Sterling's draft, the planet was supposed to be like a futuristic city. And they slashed the budget to make it more of this earthy hut agrarian thing.
Yeah.
And I actually think that actually works.
Yeah.
I actually think the movie would look incredibly, dated if they try with this, Logan's Run.
Right.
I was just going to say Logan's Run. I was like, it would look like Logan's Run or like 70s Buck Rogers. It would not have looked great.
It wouldn't look like that, but I'm glad they kept it kind of earthy and low budget. I think it actually helps with the movie's overall aesthetic.
So let us pick up on, since the movie is so famous, we don't have to recap everything. Basically, it deals with religion and race. We'll get to that. But one of the things that people do pick up on, and people who look at it now and think that it's cheesy, is they'll say, well, how do they not know it's Earth? It's got the exact same atmosphere. It's got the exact same weight. It's got horses. It's got human beings. They speak English. Now, in the book, Ulysses learns the language of the apes, which is different. That's why we get that.
Mm-hmm.
But and then at the end, I guess they cover up the moon. They say at night there's electrical clouds or something. Early on, they say, so they can't see the moon. But is that only in the Forbidden Zone? I don't know. So what do you think of, both of you? Let's go with Ryan first this time, about the people that say, well, duh, it's Earth. How does Heston not know this? Ryan?
Well, I think that I'll just kind of go back to what Gordon said, is that like if you know the twist going in, it doesn't harm your enjoyment of the film. I mean, and like you said, I love the way it looks when they crash the ship, and I love, even if you're speculating that it's a future Earth, putting that all together is fun. Go ahead.
And the first person viewpoint was done to save money too of crashing, and it really works because you have
Well, I love the way it looks. I think it's kind of like. Well, here's what I think. First of all, I think that there's that Twilight Zone episode that Roddy McDowall was in before Planet of the Apes. I think it had been before Twilight Zone. What is it called? People Are Alike All Over. Okay, and Roddy McDowall crashes on a planet. He doesn't know that it's not Earth. Like that's not the thing. But he gets put in like an alien zoo or whatever, and he doesn't know that he's in a zoo. He's interestingly enough put in there with the actress Susan Oliver, who played Vina in The Cage and had the exact same premise in the Star Trek pilot from '64. But does the fact that the aliens speak English in that Twilight Zone episode, distract from it? I think this is where like some science fiction. I think that you're right, Dan. You said this is like an example of the triumph sort of soft sci-fi in the cinema, right? Yeah. I think that if you start to get into why do the apes speak English, it becomes a problem. The joke I make about this is like, I lived in New York for almost 15 years, and I remember watching the Christopher Reeve Superman, the '78 film, and I was like, Lois Lane is a junior reporter at the Daily Planet. How can she afford this apartment with the open air veranda? You know what I mean? So, but it's like, if I'm worried about Lois Lane's apartment,
yeah,
but I'm okay with the guy who crash landed from the planet Krypton, who also speaks English. Like, I don't know. It feels like it misses the point of having a big analogy for a movie. You know what I mean? I think that it misses the point. It's kind of like in like the Sherlock Holmes stories, like Baker Street doesn't exist. like the way that it's described in those novels or those short stories and in those 4 novels. So it's like people are like, this is an error, and it's like, well, is it? Like, isn't? I don't know. I think that it's just it feels like an unnecessary like continuity nitpick. And honestly, as a child, it never occurred to me.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So like when I saw the film for the first time, when I was probably like 10, I was blown away by the twist. You know, like so I mean, like whatever. I mean, it's hard to remember it, but I do remember being confused.
Yeah.
Like, and being like, wait, why is there the Statue of Liberty? And my dad being like, oh, they're on Earth. And I'm like, oh, like not even really even getting it.
Yeah.
But just like being like that I was like, something has happened in this narrative that is very disturbing. So I don't know. I think that you also got to figure that it's a movie made for a mainstream audience, whereas you could argue that 2001 isn't.
Yeah.
Right? Like Planet of the Apes is like swinging for the fences. This is a movie that it was saying, this is a movie everybody can get into. It's going to be deeply political, super dark, but it's also got apes on horseback chaining up Charlton Heston and this woman named Nova, who's in a Raquel Welch outfit. You know what I mean? So I mean, like it was a populist film in the way that The Twilight Zone was populist. It was saying, like, I talked to Norman Spinrad, who wrote for the original Star Trek and wrote a bunch of science fiction novels in the 60s. And he was telling me about reviewing 2001 before it came out. And he said something about how what people forget about the 60s is that a lot of these science fiction tropes that people have been doing in novels and short stories for, decades and decades and decades were finally being thrust into the mainstream. Right. And like one of, like the twist ending that you're really on a planet that you didn't think you were on, or you've actually traveled forward in time, not backwards, or, whatever. The time machine, right? Like he goes forward in time and the Morlocks are eating everybody. But, they're the humans as well. So that's a similar twist that was done 100 years prior with H.G. Wells. Right. I think that what happened in the 60s is a lot of those like inexplicable science fiction plot devices that upon scrutiny break down, right? Like Robert Heinlein's All You Zombies. Like, how can he be his mother and father and ancestor? Yeah. And you're just like, whatever, that's the twist ending, deal with it. So I don't know. I think that the power of having that kind of science fiction film for the general public who had never read a science fiction novel, knew nothing, I think is just great. And so if the twist ending is flawed from a plot perspective, I was just talking about Indiana Jones the other day, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and people are like, at the end of the movie, the Nazis get melted, right? And all their faces get melted off. But Indiana Jones didn't do anything to make that happen. So him being there was meaningless for the film. Well, it's like, well, who cares? Like, nobody cared when they saw the movie, right? Well, like, they didn't notice that, I guess.
The example I use is at the end of Lord of the Rings, these giant eagles come down and save Frodo and Bilbo, and everyone's like, well, why the hell didn't they just use those eagles to fly the ring into Mount Doom and drop it? The answer is simple, because if they do that, there's no freaking movie.
Yeah.
An editor of mine at Tor, she used to say there was a line cut from the film in which Gandalf went, "The eagles are busy."
Eagles. But also, I think a larger point is that when the script of this thing is written, like a Twilight Zone episode, the twist is not just there to have a twist. Okay, listen to me, M. Night Shyamalan. The twist is not there just to have a twist. The twist is there to deliver a moral message.
Yeah.
So the purpose of the twist isn't just to say, "Oh my God, I got you." It's to deliver a moral message about humanity. This is the same thing he would do in the Twilight Zone episode. Ryan, remember that episode called Eye of the Beholder, where the girl's afraid that her face looks awful, and the whole thing is her in bandage, and they remove the bandages.
And she's Ellie Mae from the Beverly Hillbillies.
She's beautiful. She's beautiful.
Yeah, but the doctors look like monsters, and like, oh my goodness, the surgery was a complete and total failure. Look how ugly she is. So the whole purpose of that final twist in Planet of the Apes is to deliver a moral as to what this story was really about.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's one of the things that separates it from the other science fiction films is that specific half-hour structure is designed to deliver that twist. It's like, oh, humanity did fail.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe those apes were right. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's the whole function of it narratively is different.
But
go ahead, Dan.
But except that the apes basically are recapitulating a lot of the flaws of humanity. Because let's look at the ape society. I mean, they're divided into. I'm older than you guys. I'm 56, so that's why I brought up the thing about why didn't they know on Earth? Because I remember people coming out of movie theaters saying that, and I remember the big cardboard cutouts outside the theaters with the apes. But what was my point here? What was I talking about?
Plot twist about riding the twist.
You're saying people were hip to it then, though, Dan. You were saying you had friends that saw the movie at the time that were like complaining about.
And the apes recapitulating the human society, because back in the 1960s, the classical theory of race was Caucasoids, Mongoloids, and Negroids, blacks, whites, and East Asians. And so you had the orangutans who seemed to run everything. You had the warrior, the dark-skinned warrior gorillas, and then you had the scientist apes, who were sort of the plebeians, say. And so you had that tripartite de facto racial analysis. You, of course, had the fanatical Zeus as the keeper of the religious wisdom, and then we have that famous, is it a funeral where they're running through the where Heston's running through when he escapes, he runs through, and he was a good ape, and have the ape preacher, and so Zeus is a fanatic. Zeus could be an Ayatollah, a Taliban. So let's talk about both the racial American. I think the racial aspect is uniquely American in its criticism, but the criticism of religion, I think, is much more human wide. How about you, Gordon? What was your take on those two aspects?
Well, I was born in 1980, so I'm speaking purely as someone who knows about American history, that you have to put this in the context of what was going on in 1968. Remember, you not only had the Vietnam War raging, but you also have political assassinations like King's assassination, Kennedy's assassination, Robert Kennedy's assassination, and you had the Vietnam War, and you had these anti-war protests. You had in 1968 just one of those times where the orthodoxy of America was completely turned upside down. So I'm thinking that one of the things that Planet of the Apes seized upon that other science fiction films maybe couldn't was the zeitgeist at the time, where there were marginalized groups, whether you call them women, African Americans, gay people, young people, whatever, because there is that don't trust the establishment, don't trust grown-ups line at the very, very end from the Young Ape, where it's a marginalized group attacking or trying to take down the orthodoxy of the group who is in charge, and the dominant group pushing back. That's why I think it kind of nailed the era. And one thing I always say is that science fiction is never about the future, it's always about the present. That you have a movie that might have reflected, I don't even know deliberately, I don't even know if this was their intent, that might have reflected the social turmoil at the time, where everyone was questioning the way we do things.
That's certainly the Rod Serling influence, and his daughter, I know, was telling me about the draft. Serling made it archly political in that sense. That remained in the script.
Yeah. I think that's part of his influence. Ryan, if you've seen Conquest, you know that Conquest gets blatant with the racial stuff. I mean, it gets absolutely blatant with the racial stuff. But I think with this movie, it was kind of more abstract. It was more just that Taylor had become a marginalized person, that Taylor had become the minority. He had become the one who was asking for his rights. And you have these terrific scenes in that third part where he is being put on trial. And there is no one who is a minority of any kind who will tell you differently. That there is a certain point where you are part of that minority group and you are asking for your rights. You are asking for something very, very basic. And the person in charge is going to tell you that religion or science is not allowing me to give you what is your right. So I think on that level, it's something that's very, very sophisticated.
Yeah, I think that it ages better than some of the other things of its time. You know what I mean? On this particular point, I will say that in terms of being an overtly political film, I kind of do love Conquest, to be perfectly honest, because it just feels like I remember it's kind of scaring me when I first saw it as a kid in terms of just they're taking over, they're fighting back, and kind of like, you know, I think I saw them out of order, so I kind of didn't know that Caesar was from the future. You know what I mean?
Well, that's a whole other thing.
You know, but
yeah.
like that sci-fi twist I thought was awesome when I was a kid. But I remember feeling like, I guess that like as a whole, I would say the legacy of the films, and the film in particular, I think its heart is in the right place, I think, when it comes to what it was saying for the time. That's my take on it. You know what I mean? Like I say this because, again, like, you know, I was writing about, you know, I think that Planet of the Apes is very similar to the 60s Trek, in that year 68 you mentioned, Gordon, is also really interesting, because like that's where your really radical episodes of Star Trek aired, right? And the really famous ones of the half black and half white guy. Now, does that age well? I don't think so. I don't think that aged particularly well. But I do think that Planet of the Apes ages better because it spends more time in this world, right? And because of that scene you talked about, like, we don't, unlike another type of science fiction narrative or a Twilight Zone episode where it's just over in 30 minutes, or a Trek episode where they just fly away and the weird planet they visited that's super racist has to sort their problems out. With Planet of the Apes, it's like, this is Earth. We are going to live with this conclusion. And we have lived in this narrative for however long the film is, like a little over, like about 2 hours on the dot, probably. You know, so I think that because it just takes its premise pretty seriously. And I guess that you couldn't say that of like a, you know, like, what is Logan's Run about, metaphorically? You know, like, I love Logan's Run, and I love the novel, the William F. Nolan novel, and who's the other co-author? I'm blanking. Anyway, I love the novel, but I'm not sure I could tell you what it was about metaphorically. And it's of that era, right? The novel is of that Planet of the Apes era, and it's like, here's what Earth could be like if things were really messed up, and we made a bunch of decisions, you know, and like we were doing, you know, so it's like, what was it saying, though, that, you know, ageism is bad? You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of like a muddled message. Whereas with Planet of the Apes, like, you kind of know what it's about race and about class, I guess, also. You know what I mean? Like, it feels like it's about, because there's the three castes of the apes, you know, and I feel like that's sort of like, you know, there's ones that seem to have power, and they're kind of sending the other apes to kind of do their dirty work. And, you know, Zira and Cornelius are kind of caught in the middle of all of that. And, you know, I think that it's great because, you know, Zaius is super, like you said, Dan, I feel like you were like calling him like a zealot, right? Like a kind of a religious zealot. But like, and then you've got like the gorillas who are kind of like just being like told to do whatever. And so they don't have a lot of agency, at least not in that film. But then Zira and Cornelius are kind of like your bridge there, right? Like, and I think that, what is it, Kim Hunter?
Yeah. Kim Hunter and Roddy McDowall.
Yeah, I think that like one thing that we went going back to Heston is like, none of this works without those two, without Kim Hunter and Roddy McDowall, to me. And I think the proof is that they're used in the subsequent films. Well, they're
really important in the subsequent films. In fact, my humble opinion is that Escape is actually the best of the sequels.
It's my favorite, one of my favorite movies. But yeah,
and I think the allegory there is probably immigration, and Conquest is more race.
Yeah,
I think that we keep talking about it. So I'm just going to come out and say it. There is a racial aspect to Planet of the Apes, and I think that sometimes people are uncomfortable with it because they don't like this comparison between, you know, apes and African Americans or something like that. So I will say, when you see Charlton Heston in chains being chained up. Just to me as a black guy, that whole image and that whole history is not science fiction for me. It is evoking a very, very deliberate reference to American history in which one group was chained up, one group was called inferior. So here's where we get into what Richard Dyer, who you had on your first show there, what Richard Dyer called whiteness, that the nightmare scenario that's being played out in Planet of the Apes is given a racial context where a white person is denied superiority over something. And he is forced to live his life as a slave would be. Okay? This is something that people like to talk about. This was in Planet of the Apes. It was in Children of Men. It was a lot of science fiction that tries to be allegorical. There is definitely an ethno component where your nightmare scenario is not the nightmare scenario for an African American. It's just history for African American. It's a nightmare scenario where a white person is forced to live as a minority.
And in the court, he's stripped naked, just like he would be, as if he was in a New Orleans being sold as a slave.
Well, do you remember what happened to the Black Panther in the trial of Chicago 7?
Yes.
He was gagged. Yeah, he was gagged. He was all that stuff. So what's interesting here, it's not a knock against the movie at all, is that its addressing of race is to take a white man and kind of turn him into one of these marginalized groups. And I think that's an interesting way to look at what would happen with Caesar later on. Okay, and the alliances that are formed between the apes. Because if you look at Conquest, Ryan, there's an alliance formed with the apes and the black guy, and that alliance goes to battle as well, if I remember. It goes to battle the Planet of the Apes too. So this is a movie that I think, like you said, has its heart in the right place, is undeniably an influential piece of science fiction, but the racial component is there, and that you were looking at a white person's nightmare, which I think is actually visualized through a black person's reality, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because the auction, the trial, all of that, you can see that image right out of Jim Crow. You can see those images right out of slavery that are adopted by this French author, that are adopted by Sterling to make a political point.
So I wanted to pick up on, I had mentioned the religious aspect. We didn't talk as much as the racial aspect. But in a prior show that I did on the Western Shane, I talked about how the bad guy there named Riker was one of the first good bad guys, in that he gives a speech talking about why he's doing what he's doing. And he sounds pretty reasonable. He basically saying, we took this land from the Indians, we made something of it, and now these homesteaders want to just, fritter it away. In that same way, I think Zaius is a good villain, because Zaius is, and when I say good villain, I mean not that he's an excellent villain, he's well portrayed, but he's a good villain in that he's actually right about the human beings. I mean, yeah, he's a fanatic. Yeah, he's covering up history. Yeah, he's doing this, but he's doing it thinking he's doing the right thing, because we see at the end, the apes didn't blow up the Statue of Liberty. They didn't make, as he said, they didn't make a wasteland of this planet. So Ryan, since you're deep in thought, what is your take on Zaius? Is he a good guy who's just masking as a villain, or what?
I mean, I think that, yeah, I'm just Gordon gave me something to think about in terms of the trial. I'm just thinking about the trial more of Heston in a newer way. I've always thought about it in the ways that we were talking about, but it's cool to sort of just find another more important layer. I guess that my thing on Zaius is that the whole greatness of the movie is that we sympathize with Taylor to a point, right? We sympathize with him to a point. And I think that what Zaius does, and I think that to an extent, Zira and Cornelius's sort of like initial reticence to help Taylor, like help sell this as well. It is just like, they like him, but they're like scientists, right? So they're curious. no one else would like him.
Yeah.
You know, because if we were in a similar situation where you've got like a Mad Max post-apocalyptic future, and somebody lands in a spacecraft, you take away the apes, right? Pretend they're all human, and that it's just post-apocalyptic future astronaut from the past lands, right? Whoever's in charge of the government is locking that person up.
Yeah.
And there's one very good reason to do so, and that's because this person is going to mess up whatever status quo we have. You know, what's that novel where there's monks that are like in the far future that are like a Canticle for Leibowitz?
Oh yeah, Canticle.
Right?
Yeah, Canticle.
Yeah. So like where you got like it's like post-apocalyptic. And there's a few monks that are like, yeah, but we used to have a bunch of technology, but don't tell anybody. Because if we have technology again, then the world's going to blow up again. So then the whole thing's about these like future. They homaged it in Babylon 5 in one episode where you've got like monks in the far future after Earth has been decimated. And, you know, they're like, you know, you got like this weird monk with a scroll and he's talking into like a computer. You know, I think that like if you pretend that they're just future humans, then Zeus's motivations are totally understandable because it, and again, like Gordon, I think you said, like, if it had been the futuristic city, this may not have worked, right? Because if it's the futuristic city and they've got the contemporary technology, you know, then it's kind of like, you know, then it's sort of like, well, what are you guys doing that's all that different? The fact that they're also have like, what do they call that? Throttling, right? Where the technology goes back on purpose.
Yeah.
I think sort of like, it's a comment on that. It's like, well, you know, if these, I think that to answer your question directly, Dan, I think that it's the kind of character that is easier to understand because they have so much fear. There's also I mean, how many years is it supposed to be that have passed?
2000, give it.
Yeah, I mean, so it's like, you know, like wrap your mind around that. Like, you know, if that were to be real, you know, if we had, you know, if we suddenly had evidence that we were more technologically advanced now, or more technically advanced 2,000 years ago than we are now, you know, our culture would collapse. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying that I believe in a conspiracy theory in which that's the case, but you could imagine, you know, that happening in our own culture and it was just destroying us. It's similar to like what happens in the subsequent films because they don't, you know, they want to repress the knowledge. Like the humans do the exact same thing, right? They want to repress the origin of Zero and Cornelius because it's just like not something that anybody could possibly accept about the future.
Well, I'll turn to Gordon, but you know, you would mention both Heston, and I'm going to say I think Heston's best acting performance is in this film because he's not playing a Mexican like he did in the Wells film, and you know the biblical films and Ben-Hur. Okay, you know, and any big macho guy could do that, and he's good. He's good in Soylent Green, but to me, this is his best character, and because if you look at the first 30 minutes, as Gordon said, Taylor's a dick. I mean, look at the way he's a bully. Look at how he treats the wimpy white guy. You know, this is the black guy, and he's not going to mess with the brother, but he's going to go after the wimpy white guy who's missing out on trees and everything. And he's constantly riding. I think it's Landon is the white guy. He's constantly riding that, and it's like, you know, shut the fuck up. You're a real dick. He couldn't get away with this in a modern workplace. But like you said, we see him. He's totally humiliated. He's totally put to the bottom. He is the great white man, El Cid, another one of his great. Well, he's the great hero, and he starts out in the same macho bullshit. He's just totally beaten down for the whole film. So what is your take, both of you, on Heston's performance? Because everyone talks about the apes and acting in ape makeup, but I think Heston really does a good job here.
I think Taylor is written well.
Yeah.
In this movie. If you want to get into Charlton, I think this is about as good a performance from Charlton Heston as you're going to get. I think Charlton Heston is one of those actors like a Keanu Reeves or a Tom Cruise who can be very good in a certain type of role, but you don't want to see them do Shakespeare or something like that. as far as to what Ryan you were saying and your question about Dr. Zayas, I think this might be a direct critique of organized religion, and particularly the mixing of church and state. Zayas says aligning scientific heresy, and I remember that even back when I saw it in my 20s, that line stuck out to me. That something can be heresy, yet be scientific. It flies against the whole premise of what science is. But I think Rod Serling is saying something a bit more telling here. He is saying, possibly, that the goal of organized religion is to suppress knowledge, that the goal is to maintain its hold. I don't know how many of you saw the Sean Connery film Zardoz, but
Years ago.
yeah, and there's a giant head
Yeah.
being run by the elites, and it's supposed to be a god, but actually it's a big ship that they're all using to get the warriors to farm the land. So it was this whole idea that if you behave yourself in the present, there'll be a reward for you in the future. So, and I don't know if people got this part, especially coming from the guy who started the Ten Commandments. It was a radical thing to teach Darwinism in public schools and to say that humans evolved from apes. But does no one see the irony of a movie where apes are denying their evolution from humans? He's talking about how sometimes religion can be so ingrained in the power structure of America or whatever that it actually will deny you knowledge. And I think that pill is easier to swallow if it's wrapped in a sci-fi allegory. Like Mary Poppins says, a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. The medicine is the moral about religion, and the sugar is this wonderful ape story that we're telling about. So Dr. Zayas, to me, is someone who actually knows the truth. And in that final act, you see that there was a reason, there was method to his madness, that he was upset here. But if I'm looking at all the Planet of the Apes movies, remakes and the sequels, you don't trust those in power. In the Planet of the Apes stories, these are underdog stories. You do not trust those in power, whether they're humans or apes. They will lie to you.
Well, there's the old saying that anyone who seeks power should automatically be disqualified by it, because by wanting to seek power, you shouldn't have it. But anyway, Ryan.
Yeah. I mean, the evolutionary sort of. I'll answer your direct question, Dan, about Heston in a second. But I think the evolutionary question is interesting because, again, it's not been replicated well in other science fiction. Mm-hmm. Right? There's not a lot of other examples where this has been done well or convincingly. There's an episode of
Ryan, did you see Voyager, Star Trek Voyager?
I was just going to say Distant Origin.
With the dinosaurs.
Yeah, I was just going to say there's an episode of Voyager, Distant Origin, where you got these lizard people, dinosaur people, aliens who live in the far corner of the galaxy, and they are denying the distant origin theory that they were evolved from dinosaurs that left Earth. I love it allegorically, but like in terms of it having the same, that's what I use an example of something that is cool but doesn't quite work, right? It doesn't have the same like zing of it being like, here are evolved apes. We evolved from apes. If things had gone differently, this could be what happened. In fact, it still could happen, if some kind of social upheaval takes place. So I think that at the core of the movie is a complicated proposition, even for an audience now who may generally accept evolution, right? I think it's a complicated thing that is done very elegantly. And I think that, to get back to your point, Dan, it doesn't work without the actors, and I don't think it works without Heston. Because he's kind of a macho asshole, like you said. You know what I mean? Like
poor Charlton Heston.
But like it's interesting you brought up Connery and Zardoz, because I like Zardoz. I love Zardoz. I love Zardoz. I screened Zardoz at my 30th birthday party, and I love it. But I think that's a film that's similar, right? Like where you got this macho, killer, right, who is thrust into this other environment. And isn't Connery's like running the immortals around on carts like a slave, right? Like he's like their, he becomes their beast.
The vortex.
The vortex, yeah. And but I think that that's a good. If you were going to do like a back-to-back viewing, I don't think Zardoz is near as good at all. But there are similarities, and I think the similarities are simply that like, if your movie's not going to work, I'm gonna go on a limb and say Zardoz works. But your movie's not going to work unless there's some kind of like, look, if Heston's character had been this enlightened, Captain Picard, like, oh, I just am so open-minded about humanity and blah, 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 then the movie loses tension, right? You need that kind of like sort of volatile character, and you need the performance to feel volatile, like that, in the same way that Connery brings to Zardoz. And if you don't have that, then you've got a problem. You know what I mean? Because then the movie doesn't feel like it has that tension, and it doesn't feel dangerous. And so it's why, like in Beneath, they have the Heston James Franciscus.
Yeah.
They bring in like that.
Heston's mini-me.
That's why Beneath is not as strong, because
the bargain basement Heston, who is inherently a less interesting character in that context because he's too nice.
Yeah.
Right. And so like you're kind of like waiting for the chaos to, and so when he finds Heston, you're like, oh, now the movie can start. And then the movie ends.
It's over. But Heston and Beneath for like 20 minutes.
But to bring up your point, it's like, imagine Logan's Run with William Shatner instead of Michael York. That's Planet of the Apes.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like like Logan's Run with William Shatner. You can't die at 30. Imagine it. It would be such a better film. It would be such a better film.
I was just thinking, yeah.
I love Michael York, but it's not that powerful because you don't have that. I think in that kind of movie, you need that really like scary, because Heston needs to reflect the thing that he also hates, right? Which is this terribleness that humanity could do that. So if he doesn't also reflect that, and he seems enlightened, and he seems sort of nice,
well,
then the movie doesn't work.
One of the key lines is when they find the Garden of Eden there before the apes come, and they're eating the fruit. He said, he said something to the effect, boys, if this is the best they've got, we'll be running this planet in 6 months. He is the conquistador. Yeah. He's the conquistador. He's El Cid. He's the great white hunter right there.
And it's why, like, if you look at Roddy McDowall in that Twilight Zone episode that I mentioned, that's very similar to Planet of the Apes, it doesn't really work because Roddy McDowall doesn't have. He's great in Cleopatra, but like he doesn't have that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think that I don't think that the Tom Cruise analogy is a good one, Gordon. I think of like Tom Cruise in like Vanilla Sky or something like that, where you're kind of like, well, that works because I genuinely believe that Cruise is going to crack up at any minute. You know what I mean? And I genuinely believe he's going to lose it. Or in Minority Report, he's good in that too because of that same reason.
My favorite is the Kubrick film because he walks around like a zombie. Well, Cruise can walk. Cruise can walk. He's got 2 legs. That's
with the mask the entire time. So
yeah. I think that what we're there's kind of an interesting topic that maybe is a larger topic, but there is like something about like the macho leading man in the sci-fi movie that is inherently criticizing a macho leading man.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like I like that, and that's interesting, right? And so I think that like there's an anecdote. I interviewed Nicholas Meyer, who directed The Wrath of Khan, and he said that the reason he got William Shatner to deliver a realistic performance in that film was he made him do like 20 takes, so he was really tired by the time he would do the 20th take, and then the take would be realistic. A critique of like the macho man in the future, I think is, I think you just need. I think it's something about it is very appealing. And I think that it makes a point in a way that a movie that was being maybe a little bit more careful wouldn't do. And it's perhaps one of the weaknesses of the James Franco series, I have to say, because James Franco is very nice.
Well, now
in the remake,
just because Ryan, you said you have you can only do about an hour, so I want to give the last.
I got 10 minutes. Yeah.
Another 10
minutes.
Okay. Gordon, you want to pick up, and then we'll just give Ryan the last few minutes, and then we'll continue for a few minutes. Do you want to pick up on Heston again, or do you want to? Let's talk.
I'm done.
Let's talk about Franklin Schaffner, the director, before we get before Ryan goes, because he went on. He did Patton, won an Oscar, I believe, for that, or the film won the Oscar. And he's a good example of the studio director. He, just like I mentioned, Shane. That director, George Stevens, was not an auteur. To me, this is a great example of a non-auteur great film. Gordon, and then Ryan, and then we'll end up with Ryan. Gordon, what's your take on Schaffner and his direction in this film?
Oh, I think it's strange because when I looked him up, there weren't. You expect Planet of the Apes, this famous film, to be directed by someone who's known as being an auteur. But I think we should always keep in mind, as useful as the auteur theory is, this is a collaborative art form. And I think that he actually does a good job of structuring the movie, filming the movie. I don't see any. Maybe he could have enhanced some of the characters a bit more as far as making them, I don't know, making the performances a bit more realistic, I guess, or something like that. But yeah, I think that Franklin Schaffner did a good job with it. So he's not the first person that comes to mind. Did he do the sequels, Ryan? Do you know?
I don't think so.
No. There was, I think, a different director for each one.
Yeah, I think that it's kind of like I think that it's kind of like talking about like the Bond films or something like that. Like real aficionados would say, "Oh, this is the director that's really good." And when you get an auteur in a sci-fi franchise, like in this case, they brought in Tim Burton. That didn't go great.
That was like the beginning of the end for Tim Burton for me.
Yeah. So I think that a movie like this sort of needs a director that kind of gets out of the way of the premise, and I think that it feels, and I say this as a compliment, the movie feels like, I said at the beginning, a really, really tight episode of The Twilight Zone with a much bigger budget, and so it's not distracting in its scope. But I will say that I always found the location shooting to be beautiful, like in its own way, and like the movie felt. It's a dark film, but it's not like a bummer to look at. Yeah. It's not like a bummer to watch the movie. Like it's an enjoyable experience.
That first half hour is terrific. The cinematography, because he's not just shooting the mountains. Like I hate when people. I was talking about in the Shane show. Just shooting mountains isn't particularly good. And Shane, when he brings the Grand Tetons up with the focus lens or whatever he does, and here you get a sense you're really on an alien planet here from the angles that he shoots. He's not just shooting, Lake Mead, I think it is. It's the canted angles from like a third man, and you get the sense that something is off.
There's like weird zooms and stuff too.
Yeah.
There's like weird where it has that kind of like. Yeah, like you don't really know, you're off kilter because it'll zoom in and zoom out, or I think that it's not distracting though. Do you know what I mean? It feels like I guess I would call it kind of a workman style direction, right? That kind of like lets the movie happen, but at the same time, it must have been a pain in the ass to shoot. You know what I mean? Just from a technical perspective, so much of the movie's outside. You know what I mean? Like a lot, like what is it? Like probably like you were saying, Gordon. Like we're looking at like 30 minutes before we see
the hour. The apes show up at 31 minutes.
So you're like you're outside for a long time. You know what I mean? And I think that like for a sci-fi movie, that's also notable.
Yeah.
That's just like it's dumb to say this, but Solaris, 2001, like other movies that were really good auteur-y sci-fi movies, they're inside a lot.
Yeah.
He would go on to do Boys from Brazil, which is kind of a sci-fi movie. If any of you guys have seen Boys from Brazil, about them it's about them trying to clone Hitler.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I know the movie. Yeah, I've heard. Yeah, now I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. And he did Papillon and
Papillon. That's a
Papillon,
good one.
I can't pronounce anything today. and Nicholas Alexandra. So yeah, he had a nice little run there in the early 70s.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's just like I can't think of another science fiction movie that looked like that. And I remember, did you guys see that movie Argo?
Oh yeah.
No.
Yeah, where it's like the whole movie implies that the character was inspired to make the fake sci-fi movie by Planet of the Apes. You know, like he's like the Ben Affleck character who is playing a real CIA agent makes a fake sci-fi movie to rescue these hostages, right? Like that's the whole premise of the movie. But he's inspired by it by Planet of the Apes because it's like outside and like this like post-apocalyptic sci-fi world. So I don't know. I think there's a look to those movies that I think that I don't see how you have Mad Max without Planet of the Apes. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is kind of up to you.
So RyanBrittWriter.com is your website. I'll link to that below here. Yeah. You're going to leave in a minute or two, and I'll go on with Gordon for a little bit. But just finally, I just want to ask you, Ryan, and then I'll ask Gordon later. If you could just sum up for someone who hasn't seen it, why do you think Planet of the Apes is a great film?
I think it's a great film because it is a blockbuster science fiction film that feels like an entertaining movie that you can show to literally anyone, that immediately becomes a smart movie that lingers with you because of its sort of allegorical messages and just absolutely gutsy premise, right? Like to have a premise where, I mean, the movie is called Planet of the Apes. It is a movie about people dressed as apes running a future version of Earth. That is inherently, the fact that people even attempted to make it is nuts. That is a hard sell for most people. So the fact that it succeeds at delivering on its premise, just that, and it does so in this very mainstream way, but it doesn't sell itself out, right? It's a movie that is for everyone that doesn't sell out. It does not. I think other of the films met it there, right? Like we talked about some of the other films in the series that Escape, I think, meets it, and I think that Conquest meets it in terms of its political integrity. But it doesn't. It's a movie with political integrity that is wrapped inside a kind of a timeless blockbuster, and I think that to me is sort of like an amazingly potent way to deliver science fiction.
Gordon, before we end the show, Ryan had to go. So there were a couple of scenes I did want to get and pick your brain about here. And it gets back to the religion science thing, and then, of course, the ending. I really enjoyed the first time I was a kid, and I remember seeing this movie on like Sunday night as a blockbuster, in the early 70s. It was the only one of the 4 Apes movies that I didn't see in the theater. I would have only been 3. My favorite scene is when they're in the cave and Cornelius is explaining to Zaius and Heston Taylor, well, if you go back 500 years, we go back to a more primitive society. And then 1,000 years, we had wild apes running around. But then, at a 1,500 years or whatever, we see a more advanced society. And then we get the human baby doll thing. And I really, as a kid and who really enjoyed science, I really found that interesting how they could sort of twist what science really does for the purposes of this allegory. What are your takes on that particular scene?
I really liked the scene where they talked about the doll and the whole doll being proof.
Yeah.
It was basically proof. It was allegory. I never saw. I don't know if you ever saw this British sci-fi show called The Survivors.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. So it's about life after this plague wipes out. And one of the premises that Terry Nation kind of went into was that we have become so far removed from the technology, not of the computer, but the technology of like a fork or a knife. And how he was saying that if everything shut down, would people know how to rebuild the most basic parts of the humanity?
Yeah.
So one of the things that's always interesting to me is this concept of how far we are removed from the past, of that just a few hundred years can go by and that world that was a few hundred years that maybe our grandparents lived in is foreign to us. I couldn't survive in that world. So I think it was an interesting way of bringing in these kind of time travel elements, these kind of elements of removal from the past, and I really liked that scene. I don't remember if it was Charlton Heston because a girl doesn't talk, or Dr. Zaz said it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really like that scene. It kind of talks about the intelligence of the film.
Yeah, and oh, I was just going to say, but I wanted to talk then about the ending too, and we've mentioned it, and obviously the famous ending. It's on. Everyone knows about the blown up, or either it's blown up or it's sunk in sand. We don't know. I guess Heston says it's blown up, so we can take that. But the thing I love is the build up to it. You know, they're riding on the beach, and then we see his face. And then we see like the spoke of the thing, and you know it's like, what is this? Is this like a crashed UFO? Is this some are aliens going to come out and then battle the apes for the? And then slowly but surely, when we see him looking down from behind, we're on top of the Statue of Liberty, looking down at him, and again, mankind is made small. Heston's there, and then he's like, oh my God, those son of a bitches, they blew it up and what? And then we're saying, what the hell is he looking at? And then bam.
Yeah.
And so there's really good direction. That's perfect.
I would agree with that. Yeah, I would agree with that. It is unfortunate. I mean, it's something it is unfortunate that there is I have no idea what it was like to be in the theater in 1960 and see that shower scene from Psycho, because I've seen it 10,000 times since then, and what it must have been like to be in the audience. It's like, oh my God, this is what happened. Or I was never in the audience when you found out who Luke Skywalker's father was. So it must have been something really, really special to be in the audience at that time and go, oh, I get it. I get what they're doing now. This might be me looking way too much into the movie. But I don't know if you remember this line that Charlton Heston said at the start of the film, where he's talking to one of his fellow astronauts, and he says, because he was talking about how far they are removed from Earth and how much time has passed on Earth. And he said, even if there's a statue built to you, that statue is probably decaying right now.
Yeah.
And it's probably moldy and green.
Yeah.
So everyone you loved is gone. Yeah. And what image is Charlton Heston confronted with at the end?
Right.
A statue.
Yeah.
A decaying archaic civilization that used to be run by humans.
Yeah.
I also think that there's something that we've lost, fortunately, with the end of the Cold War. I think that audiences coming up in the 1960s, and especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis, they were aware that the world could be destroyed in a matter of minutes.
Yeah.
So it probably tapped into a fear that I don't think my generation or the younger people coming up now, I think we have different fears we have to worry about now. And there are different movies that deal with those fears. But I think that the idea of nuclear destruction was particularly potent probably in 68. And there was something about that ending that tapped into that fear that people might go to the movies to escape from, but all of a sudden they will be confronted with it in that last scene.
Right, but it's also the ultimate symbol of America, that America's hypocrisy, America's strength, and now it's reduced to rubble. It's like that famous poem by Percy Shelley, Ozymandias, about the statue falling over, and no one knows who it's even made to do.
Yeah. So it's a symbol of America too. So none of these movies, none of these Planet of the Apes movies, even the remakes, none of them really have optimistic endings.
Yeah.
They're all sad, pessimistic endings. Rod Serling was probably famous for writing these pessimistic endings. And I think people probably left the theater exhilarated by how good the movie was, but also saying, yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah. Yeah.
We probably are doomed. Yeah.
Well, we talked about the original book earlier when Ryan was here, and I've always wished that they actually made, if they were going to reboot the series, they had made it with that, because the book, if you ever get a chance to read it, it's really a terrific book. That book doesn't have any need for a sequel because of the way the twist ending of finding out that it's apes reading about this human that goes to an ape planet. They're like, well, what's so unusual about that? Apes having a planet. It's a human that's unusual. But I don't know if you know, the original sequel idea was supposed to be called Planet of Men, Planet of the Men, wherein Nova, instead of being found by James Franciscus, is pregnant by Taylor after Taylor has been captured by the mutants, which were part of that planet. And then Taylor's son leads a war against the ape to take back the planet. But it's kind of silly though, because when you think of it, the apes are at what level of technology? They're maybe at about 5th, 6th century AD technology. How that it's like, okay, yeah, the mutants have a bomb, but if we don't know that mutants exist, we only see one village. We don't even see, we see Ape Sodom. We don't see Ape Gomorrah.
Well, yeah, the humans on the planet of the apes don't seem like the brightest humans around. So I'm not. I mean, at least Dr. Sayers got his doctorate.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure how well that war would go for humans. But interesting premise. They tried. It seems like the Tim Burton version of 2001. They tried to capture that ending, but I remember being in the theater saying it makes no sense to me. So
well, I just want to thank you, Gordon, and I'll link to, you have a YouTube page where you do have some videos up. I'll link to that again. So I just want to thank you for spending another hour or so speaking with me, and I'll have you back soon, within a couple of weeks maybe. We'll be talking about Blow Up, hopefully, the great Michelangelo Antonioni film. So thank you again, Gordon.